Good morning, everybody. It's quite an honor to be the kickoff speaker at this conference. Now, Paul has reviewed a couple of my credentials. Sometimes I'm asked to give keynotes at conferences in Amsterdam or Latvia or St. Petersburg and so on, where the work that I've done is not particularly well known. It's been pretty much in academic journals. I've never been on Oprah. I've never had a best-selling book. So I've usually felt a need to kind of start by actually going ahead and describing how I came to be an expert in this area. And I did notice when Paul asked that it seemed like everybody here has had a personal experience that has led them into working and wanting to find out more about this particular area. But I'm going to still go ahead and share my own spiritually transformative experiences and one that triggered my involvement in this whole area. And I also hope there'll be an opportunity for those of you here to have a similar kind of platform, because I think that's how we all learn from each other. And in this particular area, these stories are very important and revealing of the nature of this phenomenon. As a prelude to this, and I have told this story before. It was a story that for 20 years I was very hesitant to share. I didn't share, I should say. I mean, I kept it buried, basically. And then after writing a number of case studies and getting involved in the Spiritual Emergency Network and so on, after 20 years, I went ahead and published an account of my article. And as I mentioned yesterday, in an article, and as I mentioned yesterday, this article got picked up by the consumer movement. It was an article called Divine Madness, and it was published in a magazine rather than an academic journal, because I felt in a magazine I could really just share my experience, whereas in an academic journal I'd have to have all these footnotes and caveats and references and so on. So I put it into a popular magazine, and once it got picked up, it led to a number of invitations to present at conferences of consumers, and consumers is the self-chosen label that people who have otherwise might be called ex-patients and so on, or consumers of mental health services, have asked me to present at their conferences. And at one of them, I went ahead and prepared this slideshow. So let me go ahead and present that. And the background to this is that it occurred in 1971. I was I had been a graduate student at Harvard in anthropology. I was 23 years old. And I actually started what I would call an existential crisis, really questioning why I was in graduate school. My father had been a professor, and my grandfather had been a professor. So all of a sudden I really started to question whether my decision to go to graduate school was really a manifestation of who I was, or whether this was something I had pretty much been programmed to do my entire life. So with that burning question, I dropped out of graduate school rather precipitously right after I got my master's degree, and would have started working on my dissertation proposal and such, and got rid of everything that I owned that wouldn't fit into a backpack, and started hitchhiking around the United States, up into Canada, I went to Mexico, and ended up in San Francisco in 1971. Although this was still culturally what we call the 60s. What we call the 60s was really about 1965 to maybe 1973. So I hit San Francisco at a time when it was still in the flower power kind of days. It was past the peak, but it was still there. And while walking around Golden Gate Park, somebody offered me a tab of LSD.
Of course.
And yes, it was culturally the 60s still. So, and believing that I was kind of on the road to find out, some of you may remember that Cat Stevens song being called On the Road to Find Out, and doing things I had never done. I had, in fact, lived a very sheltered life. Really, my summer jobs were working as a research assistant at universities, and hadn't traveled. I'd never been to Europe, so I had, in fact, lived this very sheltered life. And one other caveat I'll mention is that my family was Jewish. We had been raised in a very secular way. We were kind of what are called cultural Jews. So we were never members of a Jewish temple. I had never been taught all the Jewish ritual and prayers and things like that. Okay, so when I was given the LSD, I didn't take it right then. I saved it for the next day, got up in the morning and took it, and was mostly in Golden Gate Park, walking around, and those of you who have taken psychedelic would resonate with these kinds of experiences, walking around and seeing the trees breathing, and I walked to the coast there. There's a beach at the end of Golden Gate Park, and just felt like I was in this deep state. I wouldn't even know what to describe it, just watching the waves roll in, feeling like I was merging with the ocean and so on. But at the end of the day, I went to bed thinking, well, that was an interesting experience, not life-changing or transformative, but interesting. I might consider doing that again sometime in my life. Then, 4 days later, I woke up in the middle of the night. I was just crashing at somebody's apartment. And as I was walking into the bathroom, I looked in the mirror. And all of a sudden, I started to hold my hand like this. Now I would know that this is called a mudra, and there's a variety of them in Buddhism, but I had no exposure to Buddhism at all. In fact, at that point in my life, if anybody had asked me, I would have had no trouble saying I was an atheist. And I wasn't even interested in really having a dialogue about all these issues. It just wasn't of interest to me. As I was holding it, my hand started to glow, started to give off white light. And with that, I knew that then I was a reincarnation of Christ, of Buddha. And at the same time, a reincarnation of Jesus Christ. It was just an instantaneous flash. And that I had a new mission, that in their historical periods, Buddha had created a religion for the East, and Christ had created a religion for the West. And even saying that, I realized how reflective that is of the limited knowledge base I had about religion at that point in time. But that was what I believed. And that my mission was to write a new holy book, one that would unite all of the peoples of the world, and that my studying ancient civilizations at the University of Chicago and anthropology at Harvard was all meant to prepare me for this task of writing a new holy book. And I literally, took this journal that I had been keeping out of my backpack, and right then just started to write this new holy book. And to help me write this, I had conversations during this time with many luminaries. I felt I needed to talk and ask Bob Dylan how one gets things out into the world, because people like Bob Dylan and Cat Stevens, they spoke the language that was current for that era in terms of getting new ideas out into the public. But I also talked with people like Rousseau and Locke and so on. Rousseau wrote that book on the social contract, how we all agreed to live together in a community, in a culture. I also talked with Freud and Jung. And these were actual conversations I was having in my head, but they were actual back and forth discussions. And that's R.D. Laing there on the left, and the anthropologist Margaret Mead, who was one of my favorite anthropologists, and so I wanted to consult with her about all these issues of how to construct a new global society. Okay, so that was about 5 days of working on this book, during which time I slept very little. I would take an hour nap here and there, but mostly I was writing, taking a quick snack, but that was it, very focused. And at the end of 5 days, I had completed this book. It was 40-ish pages. And then the question was, well, how do I disseminate this? And for my limited time in the Bay Area, I had concluded that Berkeley was the new Jerusalem. And there at the bottom you have a picture of Jerusalem, and then at the top a kind of New Age city emerging from that. And I went there, and I actually went right in front of what was then Cody's bookstore, which has now since closed, but the whole place pretty much looks like it did back in 1971, with people selling tie-dye T-shirts and handmade jewelry and stuff like that. And I took my book and I started to hand it out to people on the street, just as they were passing by. And my assumption was that the people I would pass the book out to would read it and really, be transformed by it, and then they would, of course, want to pass it on to their friends. Their friends would then pass it on to other people, and that's how this book would travel around the world. So, having distributed the book that way and having mailed a bunch of copies off to friends and family, I felt like my task was at that point just to wait. And it wouldn't be long before I'd be recognized in some way as like a new prophet of this new religion. Here I have to really acknowledge that I was a very lucky person. I really had no funds, and yet rather than end up in the streets like many people who've had experiences similar to mine, I was able to, I went back to Chicago, I hitchhiked back to Chicago, and where I had a number of friends from my college days, and I also hitchhiked ultimately back to the Boston area where I also had friends. And for 2 months, my friends put me up. They let me crash with them, eat with them, so without any sources of support, I was able to have a completed inner journey. Most people who have these kinds of experiences have their experiences truncated, often by medication, hospitalization, and so on, but I was actually able to go through this entire, what Joseph Campbell calls, inner hero's journey. And I've had a chance to thank my friends for allowing me to traverse that territory unimpeded. And it's really been the foundation for my understanding about the nature of spirituality. But then, after about 2 months, which is about the amount of time that this kind of very intense form of spiritually transformative experience takes to resolve, there's been some research, some homes here in the Bay Area, actually, Soteria and Dialysis, where people were allowed to go through a first episode of psychosis this way, and it usually did resolve within 2 to 8 weeks. So, after my feet were back on the ground, I was then with this burning question of what the hell just happened? How did this Jewish boy, who really knew nothing about religion, think that he was a reincarnation of Buddha and Christ? And it set me on a quest to try to understand this experience, and I started for the first time to read people like Joseph Campbell and Jung, and you may have heard the term cosmic consciousness. There's a psychiatrist who wrote a book called Cosmic Consciousness, published, I think it was in 1901, about these kinds of experiences. And I started this process of trying to really understand what had happened to me. Now, at that time, my parents had a summer cottage in Cape Cod, in Wellesley, and it really was a summer cottage. I mean, we had no insulation and so on. But as part of my attempt to understand what had happened to me, I felt I needed some place to really delve into this, and I got their permission to just move in there in March, which was pretty nippy. But it allowed me, the opportunity to start really reading and exploring this. But at the same time, I was also having a lot of self-recrimination and doubt and beating myself up for, this. I mean, although I was trying to understand it, I also felt very foolish about having sent off this book, that was meant to be a new holy book to people like my friends and my family, and began to question decisions like dropping out of Harvard and so on. And I was both doing a lot of reading and doing a lot of self-denigration during this time. And I was also having a lot of trouble sleeping at night, and started to have these kind of horrific images just appearing to me as I was trying to fall asleep. And I even saw what I took to be my own skeleton kind of hovering over me at night. And I developed a recurrence of something that I had as an adolescent and had surgery for, called Crohn's disease, which involves a lot of intestinal cramping and pain and internal bleeding too. And went to a free clinic and got a bunch of pills, just basically the pain medication. But on some of these nights, when I was really having a lot of trouble sleeping and really immersed in this kind of depressogenic thinking, I did start to contemplate taking these meds and ending it all. And my image was not that I would be greeted by angels, but that somehow or other this would be a state of deep peace if I just ended it all. During that time, I was also, though, in the habit of going out on a pretty much daily walk. I would wait until kind of midday and then go out on these beautiful beaches in Cape Cod and take a walk. And during one of these walks, all of a sudden, I heard a voice. And I turned around. Unlike those internal conversations I was having where the voice was inside my head, this felt like it came from outside. And this is a picture of Joan of Arc, who also had voice experiences that led her to this, leading a group of people to fight the British or whatever the historical incident was. She's still quite a hero in France. But the voice I heard only said one thing, and it said it really only one time. And that was, become a healer. And when I heard that, I mean, I was really puzzled because, you know, from my anthropological studies, kind of, that was my image of a healer. It's not something that quite fit with, you know, living in the 20th, end of the 20th century. But it became like a mantra, you know, something I kept repeating, you know, over and over again. Become a healer. What does become a healer mean? And then I started to think, well, you know, could it mean that I should go back to medical school, you know, and become a modern day healer? But I also started to think about the possibility of studying herbs or an alternative therapy discipline like yoga. And actually, as I started to engage in those kinds of questions, I contacted my parents, who actually then were willing for me to come live at home again and help support me to be able to take a bunch of these kinds of courses, which I did in New York City at the Open Center. Some of you may know about that. It was one of the early places for doing things like encounter groups and gestalts and psychodrama, but they also had classes in yoga. I don't think that's where I took a course in herbs too, somewhere in New York. But it was really this work with encounter groups that kind of grabbed me and led me to take more training in that area. And I spent about 3 years of my life facilitating growth groups, encounter groups, gestalt, psychodrama, TA, bioenergetics, and so on. And then got convinced at some point that, in fact, that was my profession, and that I would go back, hit the books again, go to graduate school, become a psychologist, and which I did. Went back and got a PhD in psychology. And I just want to show this person's picture, and that's Wallace Black Elk, who is now deceased. But I took a number of classes from him, and in one of them, it was a poignant story I won't go into about how we got into this conversation, but he shared with me that I shared with him that I had had this experience. And it was the first time I talked about it, and it was after doing an all-night ceremony with him, which was like a peyote ceremony, but without the peyote. But it was all night. And when we walked out in the morning, I just felt very cleansed and renewed, and shared this experience that I'd really been repressing and still embarrassed about, and so on. And then he shared with me that he had a series of visions in his early 20s where he had been hospitalized. But he viewed those experiences as his calling into becoming a medicine man, a shaman. And so that kind of gave me a new frame that I started to consider vis-a-vis my own experience, that it had been like a shamanic initiation that had in fact called me to my profession as a healer in the form of being a psychologist. So it gave me a whole new way of thinking about it, and that's why when I ultimately published it, I published it, my account, in a magazine on shamanism, Shaman's Drum. So that's how I got here. But in fact, what I went through, and so it seems many of you, is actually a quite ancient experience in this borderline between madness and spirituality. And this is one illustration. I mean, I mentioned yesterday shamans, but of course, even though they've been around for 50,000 years, we have no records prior to the advent of writing, which is only a few thousand years old. But it's, Socrates, certainly one of the founders of our Western worldview, said that our greatest blessings come to us by way of madness. provided the madness is given us by divine gift. And the Old Testament uses the same term in reference to madness sent by God as a punishment for the disobedient and to describe the behavior of prophets. So we're seeing that there has been this recognition of this area of overlap for quite a while. And it's something that other people have observed in, I mentioned shamans, but also the life experiences of yogis like Ramakrishna, Muktananda, visionary experiences of Buddha and Jesus and Muhammad, other Buddhist teachers, the saints and desert fathers. Many of their accounts are still read for their kind of descriptions of mystical bliss and so on. Okay. And it's something that anthropologists have also observed, Raymond Prince being a very prominent one. Highly similar mental and behavioral states may be designated psychiatric disorders in some cultural settings and religious experiences in others. And this is an important one. Within cultures that invest these unusual states with meaning and provide the individual experiencing them with institutional support, at least a proportion of them may be contained and channeled into socially valuable roles. And that's part of our role, I think, in ACISTE, is to allow people having these kinds of intense, disruptive, but potentially positively transformative experiences, to channel them in a way that are beneficial for them and beneficial for the society. Now, within mental health, there have been some people who have also recognized this phenomenon. People like Dabrowski, who won a Nobel Prize, had a term called positive disintegration. Creative illness was a term that psychodynamic psychologists came up with to describe the life experiences of Jung and other prominent psychologists. The Groffs came up with the term spiritual emergencies. In my first article, I used the term mystical experiences with psychotic features to show that these are primarily mystical experiences, but then they do have some elements that in the DSM would be considered psychotic symptoms. And then Lang used the term metanoia voyages. He opened the first treatment center for people undergoing these experiences, Kingsley Hall in London. And then John Perry, who opened up one of the places I mentioned earlier for people to be able to go through a first psychotic break without being medicated or hospitalized. And that was here in San Francisco in a center called Diathesis. Now, in the legacy that we have inherited from the primary theorists in mental health and psychology, all religion and spirituality are pathological. Freud wrote a whole book called Future of an Illusion, where he described religion as a system of wishful illusions. And actually, I think the translation of that could very well be delusions, together with a disavowal of reality such as we find nowhere else but in a state of blissful, hallucinatory confusion. And that was also similar to his view of things like mystical experiences, that these were just regressive, infantile experiences, rather than the experiences that positively transform individuals.